The teacup shook in Alina's hand the moment she saw him walk through the door again, exactly at 8 o'clock, exactly as he had every single morning for the past 2 years. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from a question that had been burning inside her for months, one she had never dared to ask. The Duke of Ashworth sat by the same window in the same chair and waited for the same pot of Darjeeling tea. He would pour it into one porcelain cup, watch the steam rise, and then, after 20 minutes, he would rise and leave without ever touching it. Today, something inside Alina refused to let him leave in silence again. The tea house on Belrose Street was usually filled with quiet chatter, the clinking of spoons and the smell of fresh pastries. But whenever the Duke arrived, a strange hush would fall over the room. The other staff members would glance at him, then quickly look away, as if his presence carried a weight none of them wanted to touch. Alina had asked her manager once why nobody questioned him. The answer was simple. He was a duke, and dukes did not explain themselves to tea house workers. But Alina was not like the others. She had grown up in a small village where curiosity was not a flaw but a survival skill. She noticed things. She noticed the way his hands trembled slightly when he lifted the teapot. She noticed how his eyes lingered on the empty chair across from him, as if someone invisible sat there every single day. She noticed that he always left exactly the same tip, folded the same way, tucked under the saucer with careful precision. For months she told herself it was none of her business. A wealthy man could order tea and ignore it if he pleased. It was his money, his time, his choice. Yet the mystery gnawed at her more each day. Why order something you never intend to drink? Why sit in silence, staring at nothing, only to leave the moment the steam stopped rising from the cup? That morning, dark clouds hung low over the city and rain tapped softly against the window beside his usual seat. Alina carried the teapot to his table, her fingers steady despite the storm building inside her chest. She set it down gently, the way she always did, and poured the tea into the porcelain cup. The Duke did not look up. He never did. She should have walked away. She had a dozen other tables waiting, orders to take, plates to clear. But her feet stayed rooted to the spot. She glanced at the untouched cup, at the steam curling upward like a question mark, and she thought of every single day she had watched this ritual unfold without meaning. Something about today felt different. Perhaps it was the storm outside, or perhaps it was simply that she had run out of patience with her own silence. Alina took a breath, steadied her voice, and finally spoke the words that had been trapped inside her for far too long. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but why do you order tea you never drink?" The words hung in the air between them like a held breath. For a long moment the Duke did not move. His fingers, resting near the edge of the saucer, went completely still. Alina's stomach twisted, certain she had crossed a line that could cost her the job she desperately needed. She braced herself for anger, or worse, for the cold silence of dismissal. Instead, something flickered across his face. It was not anger. It was something closer to surprise, mixed with a sadness so deep it seemed to have settled into the very lines of his skin. He looked at her properly for the first time, as if noticing her existence beyond the role of someone who simply refilled his cup. His eyes, a pale shade of gray, studied her for a moment longer than felt comfortable. He did not answer. He reached into his coat, placed his usual payment on the table, folded it with the same careful precision she had watched 100 times before, and stood without a word. Alina stepped back to let him pass, her cheeks burning with embarrassment at her own boldness. She had expected an answer, or at least a reaction, but instead she had only managed to make the silence between them heavier. As he reached the door, he paused. Rain streaked down the glass behind him, and the gray morning light framed his tall figure like something out of an old painting. He turned his head slightly, just enough for her to catch his profile, and for a brief second, his eyes met hers again. There was no anger in that look. There was something closer to recognition, as though she had touched a part of him that had been locked away for a very long time. Then he stepped out into the rain and disappeared down the street, his coat collar raised against the wind. Alina stood frozen by the table, the untouched cup of tea still steaming faintly beside her. Her manager appeared moments later, arms crossed, eyebrows raised in silent question. She had seen the entire exchange from across the room. "What did you say to him?" she asked, her voice caught somewhere between disbelief and concern. Alina could barely explain it herself. She had simply asked a question that had been building inside her for months, one that every member of the staff had wondered but never spoken aloud. She expected to be scolded, perhaps even warned never to speak to a customer that way again. Instead, her manager only shook her head slowly, a strange look crossing her face, something between worry and quiet respect. That night, Alina could not stop thinking about the look in his eyes. It was not the look of a man offended by a question. It was the look of a man who had been waiting, perhaps for years, for someone brave enough to finally ask it. She wondered if she had opened a door that could never be closed again, and whether the Duke would ever return to Belrose Street after being seen so clearly by a stranger who dared to notice him. She did not have to wonder for long. The following morning arrived with pale sunlight breaking through the clouds, and Alina found herself watching the door of the tea house with an anxious energy she could not shake. 8 o'clock came and went. No sign of the Duke. 9 o'clock passed as well, and the seat by the window remained empty, the porcelain cup untouched in its usual place on the shelf. Alina told herself it was foolish to feel disappointed. She was a waitress, and he was a nobleman who owed her nothing, least of all an explanation. Just as she began clearing the shelf, the bell above the door chimed. She turned, and there he stood, the Duke of Ashworth, later than his usual hour but present all the same. His coat was slightly damp from a light morning drizzle, and his expression carried none of the guarded distance from the day before. He walked to his table, sat down, and for the first time in 2 years he lingered past his usual 20 minutes. Alina approached carefully, half expecting him to ignore her presence entirely. Instead, he gestured toward the empty chair across from him, a small motion that felt enormous given everything she knew about his rigid routine. She hesitated only a moment before sitting down, her curiosity outweighing every instinct telling her this was improper. He began speaking slowly, his voice quiet but steady, as though he had rehearsed the words 1,000 times in his mind but had never found the courage to say them aloud. The tea, he explained, had never been for him. It had always been for someone else, someone who no longer sat across from him except in memory. His wife, Margaret, used to prepare his tea exactly this way every single morning before he left for his duties. The same blend, the same porcelain cup, the same careful pour. Margaret had passed away 5 years earlier, he told her, and the mornings without her had felt unbearably empty. He had never learned to make tea himself, had never wanted to, because doing so felt like erasing the last thing that still connected him to her. So instead, he came here, to Belrose Street, and ordered the tea exactly as she used to make it, watching the steam rise the way it always had, letting himself remember her voice for 20 quiet minutes before facing the rest of his day. Alina listened without interrupting, feeling the weight of his grief settle over the table like a heavy fog. She had expected many possible answers to her question, but nothing close to this quiet, aching devotion. She realized then that the ritual was never about the tea at all. It was about holding on to a version of Margaret that still felt alive, if only for a few precious minutes each morning. When he finished speaking, silence settled between them again, but it no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt shared. Alina reached out and, without thinking, rested her hand gently near his on the table, not quite touching but close enough to offer comfort without intruding on his sorrow. The Duke looked at her hand, then at her face, and for the briefest moment something like relief passed through his tired eyes. Neither of them spoke again that morning, but something between them had shifted, quietly and permanently. In the weeks that followed, the Duke's visits to Belrose Street changed in small but noticeable ways. He still arrived at 8 o'clock, still ordered the same pot of Darjeeling, but now he spoke with Alina during those 20 minutes instead of sitting in silence. She learned about his estate, about the long hallways he walked alone, about the staff who addressed him with formal titles but never with warmth. She learned about Margaret's laughter, her love of gardens, and the way she used to hum quietly while pouring tea in the mornings. But Alina also began noticing things that worried her. The Duke's coat, though still elegant, showed small signs of wear at the cuffs. His carriage, once polished and gleaming, arrived a little later each week, pulled by a horse that looked tired and underfed. She overheard whispers among the other customers, hushed conversations about debts owed by noble families, about estates quietly falling into disrepair behind grand front doors. She wondered if the Duke's world was crumbling in ways far beyond his grief for Margaret. One morning, she gathered the courage to ask him gently about his household. His expression tightened, and for a moment she feared she had overstepped again. But then he sighed, the tension leaving his shoulders, and admitted that his estate had fallen into difficulty in the years following Margaret's passing. He had lost interest in managing his affairs, in overseeing the accounts, in listening to advisors who once guided his family for generations. Grief had consumed the parts of him that used to handle responsibility with confidence. Alina realized then that his visits to the tea house were not only about remembering Margaret. They had become the one part of his day where nothing was demanded of him, where no one asked him to sign papers or make decisions he no longer had the strength to face. For 20 minutes each morning, he was simply a man with a cup of tea, free from the crushing weight of a title he no longer knew how to carry. She began to look forward to his visits differently now, not just out of curiosity, but out of genuine concern for a man who seemed to be quietly disappearing beneath the burden of his own sorrow. She started asking him small questions about his estate, gently encouraging him to consider speaking with his advisors again, to face the responsibilities waiting for him beyond the tea house door. At first he resisted, waving away her suggestions with the same practiced politeness he used with everyone else. But slowly, over many mornings, something in him began to shift. He mentioned once that he had reviewed a letter from his estate manager, something he had ignored for weeks. Another day, he spoke of considering repairs to the eastern wing of his house, a project Margaret had once dreamed of finishing. Alina said little in response, only listened, offering quiet encouragement whenever he seemed ready to take another small step forward. She began to understand that healing, for someone like the Duke, would not happen all at once. It would happen in small moments, over cups of tea that slowly stopped being just a memory of Margaret and started becoming something new, something built between two people who had found each other through nothing more than an honest question asked on a rainy morning. Months passed, and the tea house on Belrose Street settled into a quiet rhythm that felt different from before. The Duke still arrived at 8 o'clock, though now his coat was mended and pressed, his carriage restored to its former polish, and his shoulders carried themselves with a little more strength. Alina had watched him slowly rebuild pieces of his life, one small decision at a time, until the man who once seemed to be fading away had started to stand a little taller with each passing week. On a quiet morning in early spring, exactly 1 year after she had first asked her question, Alina arrived at work knowing what day it was. It was the anniversary of Margaret's passing. She had thought about this moment for weeks, uncertain of how to mark it, uncertain of whether she should say anything at all. She decided, in the end, that actions might speak louder than any words she could offer. When the Duke arrived, he looked paler than usual, his eyes carrying the particular heaviness that came with remembering a loss on its anniversary. He sat in his usual chair by the window, and Alina approached with the teapot as she always did. But this time, instead of pouring the tea into a single porcelain cup, she set down 2 cups on the table, side by side. She poured the tea slowly, filling both cups with the same careful attention Margaret must have once used. Then, without asking permission, she sat down across from him and slid 1 cup gently toward his hand. She said nothing. She simply waited, her eyes steady, offering him the choice without any pressure attached to it. The Duke stared at the cup for a long moment. His fingers hovered near the handle, trembling slightly, the same way they had trembled every single morning for years. Alina watched him, her heart aching with hope and uncertainty in equal measure. She did not know what he would choose, and she understood that whatever happened next was entirely his decision to make. Then slowly, he lifted the cup to his lips and drank. It was not Margaret's tea. It would never be Margaret's tea again. But in that quiet moment, surrounded by the soft morning light filtering through the window, it became something else entirely. It became warmth freely given, a small act of connection between two people who had found their way to each other through grief, patience, and one honest question asked on a stormy morning many months before. The ritual at Belrose Street did not end that day, but it changed forever. From then on, the Duke drank his tea every single morning, and Alina always poured 2 cups, sitting across from him as the steam rose gently between them, no longer a symbol of loss, but a quiet reminder that even the deepest grief could, with enough patience and kindness, learn to make room for something new.